Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined by Josh Blank today, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Top of the late morning, Josh.
Top of the morning.
So we'll get down to brass tacks. This is the last podcast of the year, unless we really get a super wild hair between now and the end of December.
Unlikely.
Keep an eye out. We will have some new content coming out and some new data before the year is out, but we will probably wait until January to discuss that in any depth. But do keep an eye out. We did a lot of parsing of the special sessions last week as the fourth special neared its end. Both chambers have now adjourned sine die. So, it appears to be all over except, of course, for the fundraising events, which are ongoing, which some of you are probably either unfortunately or fortunately aware of. Given the combination of the calendar and the wind down of the legislature, we thought, we take stock of the last year in politics, which was, of course, for our purposes and the purposes of most people listening, dominated by the legislature being in session virtually nonstop. And that's, particularly true if you include the Paxton trial in the Senate, during which the legislature was not in session. But, the Senate certainly was there every day, and that, made it feel, House members being back in their district, other than the people directly involved notwithstanding, did make it feel like, the legislature was still going, even though technically they were not.
Yeah, I mean, we were watching all year.
Yeah, there was no lawmaking going on. It was the, the legislature, making a rare foray into the judicial function to some degree, perhaps. And again, for those of you that are sticklers, I know it's a legislative function. Got it. But,
blah, blah, blah. Yeah, great. Pin a rose on your nose.
Right. There you go. Now, we were talking about this as we were thinking about doing this podcast, and I don't want to go too far with this, but look, for all the tumult and some frankly surprising events, the Paxton impeachment, the expulsion of Brian Slayton, topped the list of surprises, I think, to some degree, and some would say maybe some might argue in retrospect neither of those events was entirely surprising, but, they were certainly surprising as they unfolded at the time, I would say.
Yeah.
As much as you can rationalize, that these things should have happened to some degree, they sort of rocked the session, certainly, as they were happening. But still, as we've looked back, it does seem like a lot of the themes we were talking about at the beginning of the year continued to play out through the final special session, and that there was no real earthquake here. I mean, it's been very eventful. There's been a lot going on, but there's no major moving of the tectonic plates here, right? To put it that way,
right?
And that again might be a little bit of a low threshold, but a lot of these themes, that we've looked at a lot and talked about a lot, played out throughout the session. And they all had their, cross currents too, not to be too, sort of cut and dried about this, or, dialectics, if you will, if we're still allowed to use that word in public. What I mean by that is that for, every way that we might summarize a particular dynamic, there were counter pressures at work. And, as we unfold a few of these and try to look at the big picture, we'll flag some of those cross pressures. In other words, so let's start. Let's just start with I think we were talking right before we came on. One could start telling this story in a lot of different places.
For sure, yeah.
But I think, the major theme that has defined politics in the state from beginning to end, and that, if you're not attentive to this, you're not really plugged into what's, you're not going to be able to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, lawmaking, policy, governance in the state, have all been fundamentally shaped by the conflict within the Republican Party. And I don't think, at this point, again, if somebody's listening here, you don't have to work too hard to make this argument. But, we've talked all year,
mm-hmm.
and, frankly, as we talked pretty much the year before,
mm-hmm.
about these multiple axes of division, that have played out here. I mean, and we'll talk about several of them in detail as we go on, but, not to, just cut to the chase without, playing out the movie, or the plot development, whether you're talking about the conflicts between the big three, the conflicts between the chamber, the personal conflicts, the institutional conflicts, the ideological conflicts.
Interest group conflicts.
There's just a lot going on inside the Republican Party that has caused a lot of tumult.
And I should say, look, this isn't crazy. I mean, some of you might be listening, well, yeah, those things are always going on. And if you're even kind of high-minded about this, I think we try to be sometimes, you'd say, hey, well, isn't that what politics is? Aren't these institutions supposed to, essentially process this conflict and produce, an output? And I think that's true, but I think, and I'd also say, some people might also point out, hey, these conflicts have also been around, right? These aren't necessarily new conflicts. It wasn't like Dan Patrick and Dade Phelan were getting along last time, right? I mean, it's sort of, so there's those aspects to it. However, what I think, as someone, as people who watch this regularly, the centrality of the conflict to the discussion was different,
right.
or at least, or heightened in some way,
and its impact on outcomes.
And on
process and outcomes.
Well, right. And I was going to say, in turn, its impact on outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of, it wasn't just the communications strategies. It literally did affect the ability of the chambers to process the conflict and come to some sort of conclusion in some way. Because again, in some, I would say in a lot of ways, the policy desires, even of the party, the central policy desires of either the elected representatives, or you can even say their voters, were to some extent weighted less heavily than some of these conflict elements as they became more central to actually the process of lawmaking.
Right. And I think, we've made the point, I think we've sort of pointed out at various times that, look, if you follow the process or you're in the process, you're seeing this play out, within the institutions, at kind of the elite level.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have a couple of clear indicators of this in our polling too, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can see this when we look at, one of the big sort of axes of conflict is seemingly ideological. And I only say seemingly because it's too simple to just say it's ideological. I mean, in the sense of it,
right.
We talk a lot in here about the meaning of ideology at this point. But on a simple interpretation of ideology, when we ask Republicans whether their state officials essentially are performing in terms of their level of conservatism. Are they conservative enough? Are they too conservative? Are they not conservative enough? And what you find is about a third of Republican voters saying that their members are either conservative enough or not conservative enough.
Right.
And the remainder, about 15 and 11% respectively, either say they're too conservative or just don't know. But I think the main point here is, you have about 60% of the party split between two positions about the output and the sort of stated positions of their statewide officials.
Right. And I think it's interesting when you break this down into the intensity of Republican identification, those numbers, and again, these numbers have pretty big margins of error given.
Right.
We're just looking at Republicans and then we're cutting that into three different groups. So, you can take these numbers with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, if you look at the people who say that they are strong Republicans as opposed to not very strong or leaners, a little less than half, call it about half, 47% say the party is conservative enough.
Mm-hmm.
About a third say it's not conservative enough.
Right.
Right. And among those strong conservatives, only 11% say it's too conservative. Right.
Yeah.
So when you think about how, on one hand, we know that there's kind of a consensus that obviously there's not even there's a consensus among everybody that the Republican Party is the party of conservatives much more homogeneously than it was certainly 50 years ago, but even, probably 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the the faction that still says, and these numbers that we're talking about are from October. So this is after, the regular session, which, was reasonably conservative, as we've said. I think, in terms of its ideological output, probably roughly speaking, somewhere between 2019 and 2021.
Yeah.
A little more ideologically driven, a little more identifiably conservative, quote unquote, than 2019.
Yeah.
Not as much as 2021.
Right.
More or less.
More or
And,
less.
That's
value judgments.
one could quibble about that perhaps, but I think I'm
But
pretty secure in that.
Well, but broadly, to the point, to the extent that 2021 was considered an extremely conservative session and 2023 is either, somewhere in that ballpark. The point is that, you look at these numbers and you look at the actual, direction of government over that period and you'd say, boy, it's been pretty conservative.
Yeah. And you've still got, about a third of Republicans and about a third of very strong Republicans saying it's not conservative enough.
Yeah, and I think even, more to the point, what's really interesting in that data, and you put this in, and now I'm looking at it a little bit more closely, but when you look at the lean Republicans, and this is a really interesting group,
right?
And they tend to look more conservative than you'd think. And there's a whole podcast on that, which we're not going to do today. But when you look at just the people who are essentially, first we ask them, are you a Republican or Democrat? They say, I'm neither of those things. And we say, but really, do you lean one way or the other? And these people said, okay, fine, right. I lean towards the Republican Party. When you ask those people this question about Republicans conservative, it's almost flipped. You have 46%, or just under half, saying they're not conservative enough, with 30% saying they are, which is interesting because in some ways, and this kind of speaks to a whole thing about partisan attachment and whatever, but these people are part of the party.
Yeah.
And it's important to note here that what they are is they're part of the party, and really their conservatism is actually probably maybe even a little bit higher than your sort of let's just say normally strongly attached Republican. But their perception of the party's direction shows a certain amount of dissatisfaction.
Right.
And that speaks to the internal conflicts within the party in a very kind of obvious, naked way in some ways, right? Even if it's a very simple measure.
And so, I think we can't, you can't ignore that. You can't, I don't, maybe we were going to flag this for later, but as long as we're, really have drilled into this a little bit, you can't really underestimate then the degree to which over the long term, or, I should say the medium term, you think back to when we were charting the rise of the Tea Party and the ideological composition of the Tea Party, and you and I did a lot with that.
Yeah.
I think what you're seeing here is the long-term impact of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, in terms of moving, where the center of gravity, if you will, the ideological center of gravity is in the Republican Party.
And it also, I think, it is taking place in a larger, sort of historical context right now, which sees, a lack of trust in all sorts of traditional institutions, organizations, and groups. And so, this conflict is still playing out within the two-party system as we have it, because there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, and that's what we have. But it doesn't mean that you're looking at, what's interesting about these numbers is you're not looking at polarization necessarily in the same way that we think about it, or as we've thought about historically over the last 2 decades, where we think about people moving into these ideologically homogenous camps in each party, and it's like, depends on.
I would say only comparatively.
Only comparatively, yeah, and it depends on what we're talking. And it depends on what we're talking about.
Right.
So it's but these conflicts are not going anywhere at this point.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to the end in terms of why that's so pronounced. What the impact of that is here, but.
Let's do some of the other themes, yeah.
Yeah, so let's, so the other thing, another big theme for the year, and, something that we've talked about a lot, and, is the governor's, continuing political preeminence as, he leverages the power of the governorship and, in many instances with the goal and the effect of strengthening the institutional position of the governor and the governor's office. Big theme in our podcast. So, it's maybe endogenous to the discussion.
Yeah.
But, I don't see, well, I know, I shouldn't pose that way. I think it's hard not to look at the governor's job approval ratings, how he's positioned himself in all of these conflicts. And not say that, he emerges from this year, which has been a very bruising year of Republican politics, in not too different a position that he was in right after he was elected.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think.
The only caveat I might put on
that baseline comparison is not what I had in mind in doing it, but as it occurs to me, I think that's right.
Yeah, let me throw this out there as a potential caveat. Maybe slightly stronger because other people's positions have become more complicated or people have taken hits. I mean,
that's interesting.
So I mean, in the sense that by staying in this, we could say by staying in the same place, he actually moves ahead a little bit because he has been sort of a consistent presence and a consistent force. And in some ways, the other thing is he's also, I was just sort of thinking about this as we're talking about, and it's reinforced his position of strength is he's also generally treated with kid gloves by all the other actors.
Well, yeah, I think that's I think you and I were talking about that yesterday, and that's interesting. I mean, I think, and I think that, that speaks to both, and again, a common theme here, where Abbott sits at the intersection of politics and the politics of his position that are, contextual,
right,
and the institutional situation how he's institutionally situated,
right.
And I think that he to some degree does not get. There's not sufficient acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. Of the degree to which I think he has managed that, mm-hmm. and into which his political experience prior to becoming governor gave him a less steep learning curve than we've seen with other governors.
I agree with that.
I think that's right.
So I'm going to say this. I agree with that on the politics side of things. On the politics and the comms side, I think, yeah, we talk a lot about how, Abbott is in a different position than a lot of the previous governors. He has sort of no legislative experience. And so to some degree, over time he's gotten a lot better. And I think, at least in terms of what I can see from where I'm sitting, just to be clear, but I think he's gotten a lot better or more direct in his dealings with the legislature than when he started. At the same time, I think he's really grown, again, the sort of the political public weight of his office, sort of in a way that does speak to, the strengths that he has. At the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say he's, and then this would be a whole other podcast, but I don't know if he's necessarily had a higher success rate. I think he's just managed, in terms of like the actual policy output. We could look at that, but I think he's managed to put himself in sort of a position of prominence and or sort of as the victor in a lot of these fights that have gone on that have been pretty messy for a lot of other people,
right, and
seemingly not for him.
Well, I think, I was thinking about that. Look, that brings up, the kind of template for this discussion, like,
right,
where are the cross pressures? What are the dialectics here?
Yeah.
Because one of the interesting aspects of that is, there were some, as you were spooling that out, there are definitely members of the legislature right now that would say you, Josh Blank, are smoking crack.
Sure.
Because, as we look at the way that he has been, we look at the perceptions of him among some legislators, mm-hmm. particularly in the House, as an unreliable partner, et cetera. But I think it is one of the interesting dialectics here is that I can imagine that there are people on the inside thinking, how wrong could we be in terms of that we couldn't be much wronger in thinking about Greg Abbott, given how much, look, in my notes, I'll just say what's in my notes about all the bitching, that people do about him. Inside the process, there is a lot of complaining about how Greg Abbott handles the legislature. Mm-hmm. In general, how people interpret Abbott's solidity, I think is the word I'm looking for here. Mm. And what's interesting here is that I think that's been going on for a while.
Yeah.
And I think inside it's gotten a little bit worse. Now, part of this is just longevity. I think after somebody's been there a long time, and you saw a bit of this with Perry at the end.
Yeah.
People just are like, there's a certain kind of fatigue and an accumulation of grievances and disappointments that happen over time that is a little bit inevitable, I think. And I would like to have somebody on to make the stronger argument about that, Abbott should not be viewed as effective as this is implying. Now, I think because there are some people that would say, look, you can say he's gotten better at this, but as he's done this, he's certainly alienated more people. Now, that goes back to something I remember, sort of Ann Richards saying in an interview I did with her years ago about how, when she became governor, I asked her, like, is there anything you think you learned for this you could have done better? Which, she didn't love the question, actually, as I recall her affect. But, one thing, she said was, I could have been a lot better at realizing that how I was supposed to handle the legislature. That people told me that I was supposed to, get to know, all the legislators and, because then I just wasn't very good at that. I just really didn't want to visit with, I think I have to go back and listen to it. If I had my act together, we'd have found this and we could put it in the podcast. But it's something like, I didn't really want to go talk to Joe Blow. And I think she used that term about whatever. I just wasn't very good at that part of it. And,
which is which I got to say, sounds kind of ridiculous in some sense.
Well, it does, right? And she was a one-term governor. So, not to mess with the legend of Anne, but I mean, to bring this full circle without going down that rabbit hole too far, I do think there is an expectation that is part of the job.
Yeah.
And it does make you, the backslapping and the palliness a part of that. But I also don't wonder if that's not changing a little bit. And it's, and Abbott's style on that has not been, members of the legislature say he's not been consistent and it makes people think he's inconstant and unreliable.
Yeah. And I think, when you're talking, we're talking about sort of the quote unquote bitching about him on the inside. The way that I have often heard that couch is in terms of, and you said solidity, or reliability is kind of part of that. But what I sort of hear often is like, if the governor would just take a position on X, then we would know which way to go or something like that. And this is like, there's some political science 101, not 101, probably like 201 aspect of this in terms of like, how executives can, have levers of influence on the legislative branch or not, and which ones they can use. And so a lot of times it's sort of, Abbott kind of sitting there. I will say, to give Abbott, to be fair, which is, I don't know what that dynamic, how difficult that dynamic is when you have someone like Patrick in the lieutenant governor's office, elected at the same time, who's also been accumulating power in that institution to the point where, his control and presence there is unquestioned. And so it's not to say that there's not an equal counterweight in Patrick. But for Abbott, in terms of how you think about navigating, some of those dynamics and whether it's worth, taking a strong position, it's like, you can do that to sort of navigate the GOP caucus in the House, but then where does that put, everybody at the end? Well, it depends on what Patrick thinks. Right. And so that sort of, I think just to be fair, there's a little dynamic there that's sort of like, and I want to say, look, good leadership shouldn't care about any of these things and just go and do it, blah, 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 normative stuff. But at the ultimate, at the end of the day, these are politicians, this is politics, and they're all thinking, about this in terms of multi-step, games that are going to go on here. And both are playing. I cannot forget after the winter storm when, there was all these fights going on between the chambers about, basically what to do next in terms of response to that. I remember Patrick holding a press conference and basically saying, well, the governor is a very powerful person. And if the governor wanted to do, in parentheses, what I want him to do, we could get this done. And it was sort of like, it was funny because it was, sort of a poke at the governor because the governor can't do anything. The governor doesn't have control over the House. Neither does Dan Patrick. But it is sort of playing at this same dynamic here, which is, I think there are always people on, in different parts of these policy fights who want the governor to come in and use that public persona to kind of push something. But I think the voucher failure is a good example that these are not costless choices for the governor. He's not going to win every time. And even on issues where he really pushes, he might not win. And to the extent that there's a cost of that, there is a cost of that. It might not be external. It might not be in the electorate. It might not even be in the primary electorate. But in terms of these ongoing discussions about, is the governor a reliable partner? Is he, But to the point of this theme, he's still always at the center of the discussion in some ways, whether or not he's even stepping out.
And that's what I mean about and that's what I mean about the institutional piece, right? They're balancing or managing the political and the institutional piece, and look, and he didn't always win. Yeah. And when you don't win, it creates some degree of exposure. But it does bring up, look, we'll continue with this in a way because, it does bring up the other major theme that you sort of requirement of kind of understanding what's been going on in the state this year, and that is, Abbott was at the apex, and I think putting him at the apex is kind of the takeaway of the previous point, of a contentious, distrustful relationship among the big three, that is the governor, the speaker, the lieutenant governor, that has really contributed to difficulties and look, to use the lieutenant governor's term, the dysfunction of state government.
Yeah.
And I don't, and so I think that, Abbott's position is interesting in that relationship. And I think you raise an interesting point that part of the dysfunction is the kind of, the passive aggressive, antagonism toward the governor, particularly, frankly, among the lieutenant governor, who, as you say, if the lieutenant governor is talking about how powerful the governor is, it's usually not simply to make that point or to flatter the governor.
Right. Absolutely not.
Right. And so, that is such a, prevailing, condition of anything that's getting done right now. And I think it does, it does in a way, fold back on, thinking about Abbott's position and, some of the internal frustration with him, which is that, you can't, I think one of the reasons that that people sort of think about the lieutenant governor or the governor as not solid enough, or it's, whatever term you want to use there, is the fact that, there is an impression that, he doesn't make very many decisions that aren't mindful of the position of the lieutenant governor. Yeah. That may be true. That may not be true. But I think it's to me, it's very true that is how people parse it.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly looks that way.
Right. And in that case, the appearance becomes part of the reality, however true or not. And look, if he didn't to be fair, if he wasn't doing that, he would be thought of as making a rookie mistake.
Yeah, and I mean, just to mention
given the influence of the lieutenant governor and his influence over the Senate.
Right, and just to mention the cross pressures here, I mean, we're talking about this sort of the dysfunction in government because of this. I mean, look, they do find ways to agree, right? I mean, they are, look, we have to take a step back once and remind ourselves, remind the listeners, remind a lot of people that, most Republicans agree on most major public issues. Most Democrats agree on most major public issues. And so, look, a lot of legislation got passed, a lot of legislation got signed, but at the same time, to the extent that there's this desire that goes on to, I think about this, the breakfast that used to take place, right? And you used to have the breakfast. The legendary breakfast between, the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker, sometimes the comptroller, depends. But, if, not to idealize this or make it seem like it's more than it is, but to the extent that there was a regular venue where these 3 players or 4 players were having weekly conversations behind the scenes, that's very different than this sort of, I would say, desire from lots of different quarters of the party, of the process, depending on the situation, depending on the issue, to try to draw the governor out into taking some kind of a public position. But because every time that happens, it just adds to the potential for dragging these conflicts out into the open, which reinforces these dynamics again of dysfunction and distrust and basically,
Well, it was it's one of those things I have to say that I'm fascinated with, and I'll just say it. I mean, I kind of admire about the lieutenant governor's communication style is that during his press conference, when right after the Senate adjourned sine die this week, he after spending several minutes attacking the speaker, he opined that he tried to carry off that that this wasn't personal, that it was all really about policy and doing the right thing for the people of Texas, and it wasn't personal at all. And somebody one of the reporters, of course, threw back one of the
tweets
choice bits of language. Oh no, that wasn't even a tweet. It was
No, I'm saying one of the tweets that the lieutenant governor put out of Phelan.
Well,
he
he even I don't know how closely you watched that, but I mean, at one point, the lieutenant governor said, "No, somebody said it's not, he said it's not personal," and people kind of gasped in the room. He's like, "Look, we've had some fun. I mean, California Day, that was just playing around, a little of the give and take." And then somebody, kind of threw out a couple of the adjectives he had used in that very press conference, which seemed very antagonistic and very personal.
Yeah.
And the lieutenant governor just kind of laughed. And, there's a certain winks as good as a nod, in some of in some of these claims. But, this is at work. And that really leads us to the other theme here, if you want to zero in on the legislature a little more, which is, look, there's no way that a big factor this year is that the antagonism between the speaker and the lieutenant governor, with all due respect to lieutenant governor's claim that it's not personal, it really fed, the already overdetermined tension that's always there to some degree between the House and the Senate. Mm-hmm. And, to the extent that, one of the headlines from the lieutenant governor's press conference was that, essentially that the legislature is dysfunctional and it's the speaker's fault. Mm-hmm. I would say that's half right.
Right.
And that, look, 3/4 right.
Yeah.
I mean, in that, the lieutenant governor not taking any credit for the conflict or the dysfunction at work there, aside from, playing around on Twitter or something, doesn't really pass the laugh test.
Right.
Just to be fair. The near constant infighting, over, who was going to manage the agenda, who was going to get credit, that reached, I think, in more than one instance, kind of absurd levels. I mean, you were talking before, sort of recap some of that about, I think we have a sense that over time, we expect there to be these conflicts.
Yeah.
We also expect that there will be a mechanism for inducing some degree of cooperation and compromise, however begrudging, whether it's, social mores of favoring negotiation, compromise, some of which takes place in the process, or even the institutional process of, conference committee, that whole structure. And just, that was still going on, but it was just a much rougher ride.
Yeah.
And sometimes it, did break down.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the big biases in media coverage of anything is a bias towards conflict, right? And so to the extent that a legislative session begins and, one of the majority party's priorities has, a bill in the House and the bill in the Senate, and they're vastly different but covering the same subject, this is seen sometimes as some sort of a conflict, or to say, how are they going to come to this? I mean, I remember, at the beginning of the session, we look at the initial budget rollouts and see how far apart they are on the different articles and that kind of thing. And on the budget in particular, not surprisingly, they come to some sort of a consensus by the end in most cases.
And again, something that we note, that everybody noticed a lot, and it was noticed because it was telling given the priors, was that the two budget, the original approach to the budget, were not that far off.
Yeah, that was, in some ways.
There have been sessions that have been much farther apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, that was kind of easy, But the thing is, we watch these processes and people will say, oh, but, the House and the Senate are so far apart. And I think, in previous sessions, many sessions, as someone who watches regularly, say, yeah, hold on a second. Let's wait and see, because oftentimes, you don't know what's going on unless you're in those conversations or really focused on that policy, or there are discussions that are ongoing. And then one day there's a substitute bill, and that settles all the huge conflict that was apparently taking place. And I'm not saying that didn't happen. I mean, look, that happened. I'm sure that happened in a million places that we never even looked.
Yeah.
But the point is I think this session, the extent to which there were these conflicts that the session began with.
Well, it happened, it happened in some prominent places.
Yeah.
I mean, and look, I mean, this is maybe indicative of, another aspect of this. So, it happened with the grid bill.
Happened with the grid bill. I mean, happened with property taxes eventually, right?
Right.
But in both of those cases, not without a lot of teeth gnashing, and more so on property taxes even in the grid. And I think, the other piece of this was here, there were areas where they just never could come into alignment with. I mean, most notably, around the public education space. They just could not, manage to come up with some sort of a deal on something that they all, for the most part, 90% of which they agreed with on a lot of things.
Right.
And so that's one of the things you kind of take away from that and say, normally, you expect there's behind the scenes negotiation. There's there's this effective behind the scenes negotiation that is going to lead to some kind of compromise on priorities. That seems less the case this time than it has in the past.
Which brings us to another point that I think, and when we tie this all together, we'll probably circle back to this. But I mean, another thing we have to sort of mention here that I think animates a lot of this is just the continuing structural weakness of Democrats.
Right.
Right. I mean, in the political arena, in the in virtually any political arena you look at, certainly in the legislature, in the electoral in the electoral arena, in public discourse. And I think, on paper, what one might think is that these divisions among Republicans should provide opportunities for Democrats. And I think by and large, we saw some of that.
Yeah.
But other than the prominent, but, and we can unpack this, but still interesting example of vouchers, we didn't see it a lot.
No, I mean, I think, the theme, if you will, and this is not just this session, it's been going on for many sessions, that, Democrats will still find something akin to success. We'll put success in quotes, right? And it's going to be through their, sort of supportive, non-controversial or bipartisan measures that they can, co-author. They nibble around the edges of some policy areas in some cases, and occasionally they might block a bill. But they, too, are facing a certain amount of cross-pressure here, too, which is I think there's more vocal criticism from within their caucus about this sort of standard strategy, sort of this kind of go along to get along kind of approach, essentially calling for the Democrats to be a more vocal opposition party, even if that means that they're going to lose what power they have in the chamber, in particular in the House, little though it may be. And I think this is sort of, again, we're talking mostly about Republicans. We're going to come back to talking about Republicans.
And just to flag something else, I mean, and, we don't really have this in here, and we should, although we've come up on across, notice how you reflexively said, in the House.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's not happening in the Senate.
Well, that's part. I think that's part of this, too. I mean, to the extent that the Democrats, once especially John Whitmire, likely leaves, are completely shut out of any sort of real position of power in the Senate. I mean, their power is getting smaller. The policy is moving further to the right. At the same time, I think, for Democrats, they're saying, hey, isn't the state getting more competitive? Shouldn't we be trying to exploit this, quote unquote, dysfunction? Shouldn't we be exploiting these cleavages maybe between Republican voters and elites and some of these business interests in the state that have normally looked to the Republican Party as sort of their safe home, but are increasingly at odds with them over a range of policies? So, I mean, that's a discussion. It's not something that the Democrats are just going to turn around tomorrow and sort of change their orientation and change the way that they approach the legislative process. But ultimately, sort of what they've been doing, they're still doing, maybe, and I would say, look, probably to a lesser extent as time goes on, because I think, the days of like Democratic House committee chairs are probably numbered. I mean, one way or another, because it's just hard. It's just becoming less and less tenable politically. And so, when do they sort of shift, their approach is sort of one of these questions.
And look, to be fair, I mean, this is a difficult.
Yeah, it's real difficult.
It's a difficult discussion, and you can kind of, parse out, what the competing ideal point positions are going to be, right? So like there's two, I think, connected points here. One is, the terms of the discussion of how Democrats should handle what has now settled into a long-term minority party status.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm searching for the right, modifier here, because you don't want to say they're the permanent minority status, because forever is a long time. But, for all intents and purposes, they're in permanent minority party status.
I might say they're in a structural minority.
Right.
I mean, the structures, are going to keep them that way regardless of the politics for a while.
And that leads you to, the kind of discussions you're alluding to. And there's not going to be a single answer to this. I mean, I think, the relatively adult way to think about this is that it requires two things. It requires somebody to be able to settle into, attain and settle into, and be able to maintain and defend a leadership position among Democrats. And look, we saw this, I was going back and looking back for something else I was working on, looking back at Governor Abbott's State of the State speech. And it was a reference as I was looking at that to the Democratic response. And it now seems like ancient history.
Yeah, man.
But you think back to that Democratic response, and it was sort of, frequently criticized. But I mean, it really highlighted the structural problems the Democrats have, right? Is that, it was clearly divided among about a half dozen Democrats, elected official Democrats, all of whom you could see were kind of in a comparable tier in the party of certainly not having statewide stature, but being seen by virtue of, one factor or another as people that needed to be given some real estate as spokespeople for the Democratic opposition. So you have that problem.
Yeah.
Right? Which is what you really need is somebody that can handle the inherent instability and complexity of the situation of being for the foreseeable future in a structural minority, as you said, the structurally permanent minority in the legislatures. You have to have somebody that's very nimble, right, that can make these judgment calls about, when you are compromising with and trying to extract something from the Republican leadership, whether it's in your chamber, typically in the chamber, but also in the state, but mostly in the chamber. And when you are just being an opposition party by, in the more simple definitional sense of the word, and saying no and trying to prevent, obstruct, change the agenda of the leadership. And look, that's not easy. And it's not, and in some ways, even though you can say Democrats that have been around for a while now have had a chance to learn about this and get better at it. On the other hand, it doesn't get any easier. Well, if anything, it gets a little harder.
Well, and on the other hand, if you've been around for a while and you're not already kind of persona non grata, you're sitting there with your vice chair position on a committee you care about, potentially influencing maybe legislation, maybe the pace of legislation or some of the direction. And for you, again, you're a minority within your party there, but you're probably one of these people who's been around long enough in a position of power within the party to say, whoa, if we start just sort of being the party of, let's grind everything to a halt, let's say no, let's be bomb throwers, whatever that may be, let's be a real aggressive opposition party. Well, with that evaporates what little, credit they have in that institution. That vice chairmanship is gone. Maybe that committee assignment is gone, so on and so forth.
Right. Again, probably, more operative in the House than the Senate.
And this is where you kind of go, and this is one of these sort of, this becomes a very different discussion we're not going to go into, but it's sort of a normative discussion about Democratic, strategy going forward about, are you better off getting small policy victories here and there? Or are you better off just being a full-throated opposition party and looking to try to win elections as your primary goal of a legislative session?
Right. Well, and, how are those two things linked?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And
right
now, I think, I honestly would say, I think they're in conflict with each other. Now, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but this is the point.
Well, that's the complexity, right?
They are in conflict with each other. So
you want to be able to say, hey, look, despite, there's one, to oversimplify, you can go out and one thing is say, look, what you want to be able to say is we fought all the bad stuff and still managed to get some good stuff.
Yeah.
Which is what being a minority party kind of leaves you with.
Yeah.
Particularly in a two-party system in this setup.
Yeah. I don't want to stick on this point, any longer, but I agree with that.
And it's, I don't know,
But what I'll just say is, but it leaves the Democrats in an odd position of sort of being fish nor fowl here. Are they important parts of the process that or are they, an effective opposition party? And if you ask me, which is it, I'd say, well,
not sure.
Not really sure, but where does that leave us, right? I mean basically that leaves us with again the structurally kind of weak internal Democratic Party kind of left to their own devices, and so what impact does that have again more broadly on the system, right? Brings us to our next theme here, right?
Right, and so this does leave Republicans. I mean, I think one of the consequences that Democrats don't really It's it's I don't want to call it. It's not right. It's incorrect to think of it as an unintended consequence. But it's look, maybe this is just part of the large structural dynamic. Speaking of dialectics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, but left of this really basically leaves the Republican Party preoccupied with their own internal fights.
Right.
Right. That
they're not worried about the Democrats.
Democratic weakness both in the process, generally speaking, and and we probably undersold maneuvering in the House a little bit, but we can maybe come back to that. But the Republican Party as an organization this year, continue to be the home of extremists who help move the center of the party to the right. I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier when we were looking at the attitudes among the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
But both in terms of public discourse and the policy process, and what Republicans have accomplished and what they actually move through what can move through the process. The boundary of legitimate Republican politics has continued to move rightward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and I just think, we could pick a million examples, themes, but I mean, look, if it were 2015, there's no way the party was putting up a ban on abortion on the floor. It wasn't making it to the floor of either chamber. There was no chance, I would say, that you could imagine, even serious discussion about, let's say, banning books broadly in some sort of space, right? But we've moved pretty far over that time period. And I should say, look, it's not uncommon for the Republican umbrella groups to give voice to some extreme faction of the party. There are certainly Democratic-leaning umbrella groups that give voice to extreme factions within the party. However, look, and I say, and this has taken place for a long time, go back and look at the party platforms, over the last number of years, which I don't think are representative of party views. They're representative of these activists' really engaged views. And so that's been going on. But at the same time, this never-ending desire to take the party and the state further rightward is bumping up against a lot of issues, right? So one is bumping up against majority public opinion in a number of areas. I mean, notably abortion and guns. Yeah. It's leading the state GOP to, really discard very popular policies at times, like teacher pay raises. We just couldn't get to that. And it's as a consequence of not advancing, the desires of really what is a small faction of very, very conservative voters on other policy, like sometimes tangentially related policy issues. And at the same time, this is also reinforcing or requiring sort of a continued toleration, if not embrace of increasingly illiberal, determinedly bigoted sometimes factions within their party. And we can sort of look back to the last week and see the Texas GOP's failure to basically take a vote that would distance themselves from self-identified Nazis and Holocaust deniers, which you'd say that should be a slam dunk.
Seems pretty easy.
And I mean, I thought some of the stuff from that meeting was, would be hilarious, if not kind of sad, when one of the sort of the members who were for basically said, the arguments against doing this were that, well, this is too vague, and how could we start? How would we even know? And the woman, I think on the committee said, who voted for this, said, well, wait a minute, we're the party that talks about, rhinos, leftists, all these sort of, socialists, all these groups, but we're not cool saying somebody's a Nazi. Full stop. That's too unclear. So I mean, but this is what this is the cross pressure here, right?
Yeah, and I think that I think it's interesting to me, and I'll come back to this, the degree to which this kind of point in our the discussion of the weakness of the Democrats are connected.
Yeah.
Right, and we'll come back to that. So, so again, to caveat this a little bit, but also, we don't have to go into this a lot because it's kind of what the last podcast was about. But I still think, it's fascinating to me that for all the heat over these issues, and and again, I keep coming back to the lieutenant governor's press conference, which was, so intense in its in its criticism of the House and in particular of Speaker Dade Phelan, and one of those nice little kind of Patrick touches at the extent to which he kept purposefully I have no direct evidence that it's purposeful, but I also think that there's probably good records of the lieutenant governor pronouncing the speaker's name properly.
I think it's totally fair and justifiable to assume that the lieutenant governor knows how to say the speaker's name.
I think that's, and making it sound like, it's pronouncing it closer to the word failing than feeling. It's hard to imagine that was
somebody thought that was
cute. There was some mispronunciation. Again, the wink is good as a nod aspect of the lieutenant governor's
it's not
communication
It's not
strategy.
personal.
Right, exactly. But given all that, traditional stakeholders and the traditional policy networks are still at work in the legislature.
Yeah.
Even amidst all this dysfunction we're talking about. And we talk, we don't have to go, into this in great depth because, I would refer people just to last week's podcast. But, kind of our overall point last week is that however much one might criticize the extent or the specifics of what the legislature accomplished mostly during the regular session, and then you add on the special session that it took them to get the property tax break done. They did infrastructure, they did some water, they did some transportation,
broadband.
They did broadband. They've done a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I don't want us to lose that. But I think in a way
they made a publicized effort to shore up the grid.
Right. And and again, roundly criticized, but approved by the voters in the constitutional election, a very small number of voters.
And so long as the power stays on, it will seem effective.
Right. And I think if anything, I think I raise that not just as sort of but also that it actually tells us something about the nature of the political climate right now and the way politics are playing out in the state, that all anybody really wants to talk about. And by anybody, I'm also going to sort of ding the press a little bit on this.
Yeah.
I mean, the frame now becomes, from the very beginning, the most important thing in the session was vouchers, and they didn't do that. So the governors failed and the legislatures failed.
Yeah.
And, everybody's failed. And I think that's miopic and not quite right.
Yeah. I mean, I would go so far as to say it's wrong.
So would a lot of Republicans, put it that way, in the leadership that promised vouchers feel better had they passed vouchers? Yes.
Sure.
Does it mean that, they should all, they all have to have their tail between their legs and this portends big trouble? I don't think so. And we'll come back to that. So, I kind of want to talk about the overall part here, but we should also, it wouldn't be a second reading podcast if we didn't also note that, the other huge bit of continuity, but I think in a very relevant way that we'll come back to and that we raised a little bit in the last podcast, is the continued preeminence of border security and immigration. We can talk about all of these other kinds of issues that have come up, whether it's things the Democrats are disappointed in, things Republicans say that they should have done, particularly thinking about the lieutenant governor's press conference. Border security and immigration continue to be, the most sort of reliable feature of public attitudes towards policy, and the most reliable go-to and kind of a home base for Republicans.
Yeah, and I think
particularly Republican incumbents.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not going to talk about this much, but I'll just say this. If you imagine a counterfactual where, the issue of immigration and border security didn't sort of capture the attention of 60 to 90% of Republican voters and the same share of support among them for almost any policy, maybe these other conflicts we're talking about might, be more important. I mean, they may have a greater impact, but because we know that, in fact, it was not vouchers that was the most important issue for Republican voters. In fact, nowhere on the list, but issues like the border, but then also the economy, right? Inflation. Right. That's what topped the list for Republican voters. So to the extent that they spent a boatload of money, again, and ever increasing on, border security related measures, to the extent that everybody was just given the chance to give, their seal of approval to all these infrastructure improvements that are going to, not directly address, but help deal with, I think, problems facing every state and city having to do with housing and transportation and just general infrastructure, I mean, ultimately, they had those. And so
ironically, and there's an interesting dynamic at work on these infrastructure issues.
And those are basically those hit the issues that not only their voters said they cared about, but most voters said they cared about.
Right. And if even if it's not top of mind for them, it provides a lot of opportunity to go before your voters, both primary voters and general election voters, and go, hey, and by the way, look, we have a lot that we can talk about. And this is actually, true to some extent for Democrats. I mean, I've seen Democrats do this recently, saying, yes, it's terrible, but let's not forget, and this kind of goes to our Democratic discussion, it is possible to hang in there and help influence good things that happen.
Right.
And these are the things that they talk about, in addition to the kind of, smaller pieces of legislation that entrepreneurial Democrats are successful in passing. Feminine hygiene program, product tax exemptions, et cetera.
Right.
Okay, so let's step back. So how do tie this all together? And, I'm going to set aside something. I am going to say, before we go to tying it all together, one of the interesting things about the immigration border security point is that, we could go back to virtually every single point we previously made or theme we explored and use immigration and border security as illuminating of some aspect of each one of those points. I was kind of going back and doing it in my head.
Yep.
It's pretty amazing.
And if you're sitting here thinking to yourself, if you're taking notes on the themes that we've been laying out, and you think to yourself, no, that can't be right. No, really go back and do it. Because if you start to think about it, you'd think, well, wait a minute, but aren't these contradictory? And the answer is yes, and you still saw this dynamic play out.
Right. So, okay, so as we tie all this together, I'd like to close out in the last few minutes here. What do you kind of go, oh yeah, what ties this all together, where I think this all kind of puts us? What do you think of first?
Maybe I'm myopic or I'm just looking at what's in front of me, but it does make me think about, whether or not this is going to have any sort of impact on the elections. And I say elections plural, not to say within this election, but I'm thinking elections going forward over time. I wonder, we talked about the Democrats being in a structural minority, and I think that's, very true. And we've talked about why that's the case, here before with, redistricting, et cetera, et cetera. But, I do wonder to some extent whether or not, the word, Dan Patrick's word here, dysfunction, is going to eventually accumulate to create problems. And some of that is, I think, does perceptions of dysfunction within the GOP impact, their own turnout, in certain cases? I think there's obviously a lot of conflict going on at the, thinking about like the presidential election and sort of the fighting that's going on within the Republican nominating fight. Now, Donald Trump will probably become the nominee, but obviously it seems, and polling teams indicate that there is certainly a significant share of Republicans, for an election who have issue, right? And then the question becomes, I think, do Republicans in this state eventually have issue, either with the rightward shift of the party or with the dysfunction over some of the basics here, like can we give teachers a raise? Let's say things like that. Right. I'm a little skeptical. Now, part of it is the timing of things, right? I think one of the things that works out for the legislature in terms of statewide leadership and their impact on it, which is a lot of what we've been talking about here, is that they've got an election off. And so really, I imagine the presidential election is really going to subsume any of these individual kind of issues and these, going forward. Is it going to have an impact on the primaries? Well, this is when it's going to have an impact, if it's going to have an impact. I think what's sort of interesting here is, everybody sort of looks at what happens and then takes that as, justification for whatever their interpretation of the world was before it happened to say, you see, this is because X, Dan Patrick will say if a bunch of House members get swept out. At the same time, favorite word of ours, it's all endogenous. So to the extent that Republicans have been spending a year essentially hitting each other over the heads with clubs and calling each other rhinos, well, yeah, that's going to create some uncertainty.
Right. I think we talked about this a little bit last week. Yeah. I think that's a great point because, I think we were saying, I think this was last week, I did the thing for Pat, and I can't remember what I said in the podcast and what I said in the Pat thing, so forgive me. But you, Josh, and our audience,
I forgive
members.
you.
But on one hand, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of primary races this time, and it's going to be kind of more wild than we've seen in a while because there's so many more challengers. On the other hand, as you're kind of implying, like, well, of course,
Yeah, Republicans have created the dynamic that invites lots and lots of challengers. If you're anyone who considered running for office, in a Republican primary or for, the state house or the state
there's
Senate,
a market response piece.
Yeah, there's a market response. You've created, you've told people that, they should be really unhappy with these representatives. So not surprisingly, a bunch of people say, you know what? Let's go give it a try. Now, does this impact the general election? I'm a lot less inclined to think so. One, because of the question we've raised about.
But it's contingent on what we see in the primaries to some degree.
Well, I was just say it's definitely
some degree.
Yeah. That's what I was going to get to. Is that depending on who makes it through these primaries, Republicans may finding themselves in more competitive races in some places than maybe they would have thought. At the same time, we go back to the Democratic piece of this, and Democrats haven't necessarily lined themselves up as a full-throated opposition party focused on essentially electing majorities at this point, as far as I can tell. I mean, and that's like, in saying that out loud, it almost sounds like, no, that's crazy. No, but it's not crazy. I mean, if you're watching it and thinking about it, and I mean, I'm not trying to be mean here, but I mean, you think about
Just being unintentionally mean.
I mean, unintentionally mean, but you think about, the successes or lack of successes of the Democratic state party in terms of, and I'll just say, in terms of even meeting their own metrics.
Sure.
Right? Yeah, I just don't see that happening. Having said all that, you look at, I mean, I think the question I have as someone who's watching this in the long term is there an accumulation effect? You look at Uvalde, you look at, and the basically total failure, I think, in a lot of ways of the legislature to really respond to that, and I'll stand by that. You look at the grid failure, and then you look at, the abortion law, you look at, and then you look at just the consistent inability of statewide leadership to come together on things that seemingly everybody was for. I mean, they got somewhere on property taxes finally,
right?
But it was teeth pulling.
And now they got a little bit of a problem with that potentially because of this challenge to the election. Now, I kind of think they're going to figure out a way by hook or by crook, but it speaks to your point that the difficulty that they're having with that is also in part a function of having sent mixed signals and also cultivated, the forces that mounted those challenges to those elections to begin with.
Right. So all these themes are playing out, I think, in very real ways. But I think the thing that is just sort of those impacts are slow. They're slow going, and I think anyone who says, well, they didn't give teachers a pay raise, so aren't we going to see Democrats? It's like, no. Like, oh, they didn't pass a voucher program, so aren't all these? I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're in a position I think we often find ourselves in, which is sort of like, so look, it's going to be it is going to be an interesting election, primary election season, potentially an interesting election season as a result of all this. But is it, where we started, does it portend a huge shift? You're skeptical.
I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
So what about you? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I on the election part.
No,
I
meant overall, but
yeah, I mean, overall, look, I mean, I suspect that if I go back to the last podcast of last year, this is going to be remarkably similar to what I said last year. But I mean, I'm just, I remain fascinated by the relationship between the partisan dynamics in the state and the partisan, the structural balance of power between the parties in the state. And, you were talking about the future accumulation, of all the effects of this and the accumulation of that, how long that set of structural elements has been in place. In other words, we're now going to enter our third decade of, kind of monotonic Republican rule in the state. And, looking at election dynamics is, what's always right in front of us. What's harder to see is, what is the impact that this is having on, the capacity for governance in the state and the nature of governance in the state. I'd like to move beyond, the simple formulation that, if you have more competition, you have a, bigger marketplace of ideas and you have more compromise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe not.
Yeah, under some conditions.
Yeah, under some conditions. But, what seems to be increasingly apparent is that, the presumption of limited or no competition in the general election is affecting governance, not just in the policy output, but in the functioning of government.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what we saw a lot. I mean, we've been forced to, not forced, but as we've kind of parsed this out, as we've talked about it in the last few weeks and today in the podcast, we kind of saying, yeah, look, they got some stuff done, but it was harder.
Yeah.
But I think there's also the question of what doesn't get done what doesn't get addressed and what the patterns of that are.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you take even the things that we're trying to be, kind of even-handed about, you look at the nature of what happened with all of the effort and the resources putting into securing the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And the policy outcome of that, without getting into, too far over the end of our skis here, is open to a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
In terms of what, and as you say, as long as there's not another grid outage, maybe,
Doesn't matter.
it'll be fine. But, it might not. And there's
Right.
a lot of reason to think that could have been done a lot better. You look at, abortion not as a political issue, but just as a public health
Right.
policy issue, and the outcome of the extremity of that abortion legislation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a story in the news in the last couple of days where a woman has gone to a judge to have a judge sign off essentially, and that's oversimplified, but
Right.
not too far, not so much, on her ability to get an abortion in the case of a life-threatening
Fetal anomaly, basically.
fetal anomaly in the abortion.
And it's life-threatening
Right.
to her, and there's a fetal anomaly. The baby is not going to survive.
Right.
And the judge actually has granted her permission as of this recording
right,
now,
that's
which will
right.
almost certainly be, I'm expecting to be appealed by this afternoon.
But, that's, if that's not a perverse outcome in terms of just thinking about the delivery of healthcare,
yeah.
I don't know what is.
Well, you're putting the
right?
state in the position of making some pretty untenable arguments.
Right. And you look at, what the legislature is able to pay attention to, what they're not, and what they're able to execute. I'm interested, in a rare moment of, social science, sustained thinking about social science. What is the relationship between those two things? Because it does seem to me that the diversion of all of this, conflict within the Republican Party and within, and the way that it's now being acted out inside institutions of Texas government and politics, is having a very distorting effect. Now, look, devil's advocate, or to sort of red team my own argument, would you rather Democrats and Republicans were fighting to death and not able to do anything like in Washington? Or I see that this is not the only way of that there are other ways of thinking about it. But this is what we have right here in Texas right now, and it does seem to me that after and I don't mean this from just looking at the ideological valence of the policy output. The process itself and its impact on actual governance. I mean, we haven't had an open discussion about any number of issues that, by the very nature of the situation, seem like I'm, might be saying, well, you're not thinking about liberal issues enough.
Yeah.
But, the spectrum of the policy discussion is severely curtailed.
Yeah.
And has been pushed, and the combination of that with agenda management issues that are driven by this one-party dynamic mean that the agenda of what the legislature can realistically be expected to engage right now, and realistically is a term that hides a lot of things, is really limited and is fundamentally shaped by this dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, the only thing I would add, and there's not much to add to that. I mean, you're talking about sort of how the optics of some of these discussions become really muddy. I think was something I was taking kind of out of that. And I was thinking, I don't think I can remember a recent session in which I've seen so many Republicans called Democrats by other Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's sort of interesting, this is, at a time when, really it is about this conflict within the party. I mean, the extent to which, members within that party are going to even greater lengths to try to distinguish themselves amongst each other by saying that someone who you would probably work with on, again, 80, 90, 99% of issues, but instead because of one or two issues here, they say, well, this person is just a Democrat. They're not even, they're working with the Democrats. You may as well put them in the Democratic caucus. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah. And so I think that, we talk about the weakness of the Democrats as a structural characteristic, and it feels like, of course, you're kicking the Democrats and you're kicking somebody when they're down. and I don't mind doing that necessarily.
Yeah, sure.
But that's not really the point.
No.
The point really is that, we've got a very kind of distorted political system right now. And it's, and I think, to your point about watching elections in the long run, these things happen, these things accumulate slowly and their effects have a lag.
Yeah.
And sometimes a very long-term lag.
Right, exactly.
And so, I do come out of the year, thinking, so, if you're right, or, your speculation is on target.
Sure.
I'm not saying you're saying this is what's going to happen.
I would never.
But if your, general assessment now, which I generally agree with, is that, we're not likely to see any kind of fundamental shift in election outcomes by the time we get to the, when we're doing this
Finally
podcast
doing this, yeah.
a year from now.
Right.
That doesn't bode well for the governance process and will only, and is likely, to deepen this problem. And I think that, we've seen, recent examples of why I think this is, frankly, probably a concern we should keep an eye on because, when there was some intimation and it turned out to be, from a Democratic perspective or from the perspective of, thinking about the impact of a more competitive environment, the little tiny kind of false spring that we saw after 2018 and the 2019 session, I think kind of underlines the point.
Yeah.
In that, we did see, a somewhat more opened up agenda and a somewhat more opened up discussion of tackling harder issues that are not so driven by one wing of the party or the other, or one wing of one party or one wing or the other, which in Texas means the far right wing of the Republican Party. So on that happy note, unless we get a wild hair and come back, Josh, thanks for all your work this year, and also thanks for all the work on the podcast. It's been a pretty good year, I think.
It's been fun. I like doing it.
As these things go. Thanks to all of you for listening. We appreciate it and appreciate hearing from you, so continue to do that. And, tell your friends about it if you enjoy listening to it. And you can say, hey, this is, I enjoy listening to this mostly. Feel free to add all your caveats. We caveat everything.
Yeah,
and we would expect you to as well.
I do too when I promote this to people.
So, and thanks again also really to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. They tolerate our last-minute requests, our last-minute scheduling requests, our poor correspondence habits, particularly mine. So thank you guys for all the support on that in the production of the podcast. For all of you, one last reminder, and today we did talk about a lot of data. You can find all of that at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back probably early next year with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.